So on Tuesday, Georgia's MPs passed the controversial law which requires NGOs and independent media that receive more than 20% of their funding from foreign donors to register as organizations bearing the interests of a foreign power.
Right, so Georgia's president decided to veto this controversial bill, but it may be just a symbolic gesture, as the ruling party, Georgian Dream, has enough majority in the parliament to easily override presidential veto. Now, to talk about the current situation in Georgia, we're joined by Sergey Erofeev, sociologist from the Rutgers University. Good evening.
Hello.
Good evening, Sergey. Now, before we talk about the veto, I want to ask you about that bill. President Salome Zubarishvili said the law, in its essence and spirit, is fundamentally Russian, which is an obstacle to Georgia's path to EU membership. And my question is, how influential is Russia in Georgia still?
Russia is extremely influential in Georgia, despite the transition period since the late 1980s and the famous massacre in the streets of the capital, Tbilisi, in 1989. Despite the significant growth of NGOs and new social practices and the reforms of the police introduced by President Mikhail Saakashvili, there is still a lot of old-style value systems, especially among the nomenclature. Nomenclature is the word which is inherited from the Soviet times, both in Russia and in Georgia. With the advance of free market in the 1990s, those party apparatchiks in both countries learned successfully how to manage the new instruments of enrichment, personal enrichment or group enrichment. But along the way, Georgia has been torn between the strong desire of many, especially educated people in the country, living in bigger cities, who would like to follow the way of Europe and the United States and become a liberal democracy. But at the same time, Georgia has been following, especially in the part which I labeled as former Soviet nomenclature, they try to imitate certain mechanisms of retaining power, which Putin's regime introduced for Russia. And one important instrument of this control over the growing civil society in Russia became the foreign agents law. It's very interesting how it works, because Putin's administration presented the law as just a version of the American law introduced in 1938. This is a sort of whataboutism always used by the Kremlin polittechnologists. And that worked with certain populations in Russia, and that showed its efficiency enough for the Georgian government, which is controlled by Ivanishvili, to introduce it also in that country, because without such instruments, the autocratic regime in Georgia will probably not survive.
What's your forecast for coming weeks and months? On one hand, as you said, we have this old nomenclature. On the other hand, we have thousands of young people protesting against that policy on Western integration. So what will happen next?
Here's a little bit of good news for you from the perspective of social science. Some years ago, the leading Russian political scientist, Grigory Golosov, famously said that there are many more conscious followers of Navalny and the Free the Anti-Corruption Foundation in Russia than conscious followers of Mr. Putin. The same can be said about Georgia. We can see a proof of that in the streets of the capital, because we do not see too many people protesting against the European integration. Those who are protesting, who show their conscious behavior for or against something which is accompanied by strong symbolic action. These are the people who support the European integration of Georgia. So this will never go away. There might be slowdowns like the veto introduced by Salome Zurabishvili cannot be easily overrun by the parliament, but this is not the end of the story. Many analysts are already talking about the importance of the forthcoming elections, parliamentary elections, which can be, as they say, a watershed in the country's development. Because this society in Georgia, like in Russia, is developing faster along the way of modernization. It's not only liberal democracy, it's many things, education and technology and the ways people communicate. So that way, the Georgian society has been really developing as much as they could. The only major obstacle in that way would be the position of many people in the leadership of the country who are against that type of modernization. They prefer to retain the old traditionalist ways of controlling the country. And in that way, they are very similar to the Russians. It's very hard to predict what will happen either to Russians or to the Georgians in terms of being able to overcome this pressure, this traditionalist pressure coming from their governments. Maybe it's slightly easier with Georgia because the country is smaller, and we can see that the protests are really active. The Georgians are doing something that the Russians cannot really engage in their country under the terror of Mr. Putin.
Now, let's welcome to the program George Melashvili, President of Europe-Georgia Institute. Hello, sir. Thank you very much for joining us. And I would like to continue with the topic and talk about Georgia's aspiration to the EU. Now, Georgia was granted candidate status in December of 2023. So what is happening? What is going to happen with that status right now? We know that EU is the biggest critic of this bill. Now, is Georgia saying goodbye to its aspirations and member in the European Union?
Definitely not. I'm pretty sure that Georgia is not saying goodbye to any aspirations, vice versa. This crisis, it is demonstrating the resilience of Georgian public and the ability of Georgia to fight for our European future. So I wouldn't say that there is any chance or any possibility for the ruling Georgian, or as we call it now, the Russian Dream Party, to be able and overcome the resistance of the people right now. There might be a backlog. Unfortunately, there is some ways that the ruling Russian Dream Party can somehow, for some time, delay Georgia's European path, but it is charted. It is a geopolitical necessity right now, and Georgia will definitely become part of the European Union. The most important part right now for both Georgian civil society and also our friends in the West is to ensure that there is no delay to this path, which the ruling party is definitely trying to do with not only the Russian law, as we call it now, the law on foreign agents, but also with additional legislature, the so-called offshore law, which is allowing some absolutely gray black money to come to the country, and also the attempts of the ruling party to somehow reshape the Central Election Commission, thus decreasing trust towards the election. So we'll be seeing a lot of things going on in the nearest future. However, whatever happens, the Georgian public is adamant in our willingness to join the European Union. Whatever the ruling party does, no matter how much police and how many policemen they will be able to bring to the streets, the will of the people is absolutely clear. And the only thing how the ruling party can sustain its being in power is only by having the European mask, to create strategic ambiguity that they are somehow not going away from the West. As soon as this mask of pro-Western Georgian dream, which is already cracking, will be eliminated, their future in Georgia's political spectrum will be doomed.
Let me ask you this question, because I guess you're both referring to the current situation in Tbilisi, but I'm wondering how is the rest of the country voting? There will be soon parliamentary elections, and Georgian Dream has been at the helm of the country, not without a reason, I guess. So, is there a chance that the whole country will actually vote the same way that students in Tbilisi will?
Well, Tbilisi is only one example. We've had huge demonstrations in all major cities. In Batumi, in Zugdidi, in Kutaisi. In Kutaisi, actually, that's a funny story that Sergey Erofeev, the Russian oligarch who is in charge right now, he created a university. He founded it. And the students from that university, which was founded by Sergey Erofeev in Kutaisi, they protested against the law. So that gives you a pretty coherent understanding of the situation in Georgia right now. The local rural areas, it might be a little bit more difficult for the ruling party, but absolute majority of Georgian population, around 2/3, live in major urban areas, with capital city Tbilisi being approximately half of the population. So what happens in Tbilisi influences the entire country at a very, very big level. The only reason why the ruling party might theoretically be able to win the election, it is if the opposition is unable to create a coherent, strong alliance which will be understandable to the Georgian public. The way how they will be able to create alliances and how they will be able to explain to the electorate what is really important will matter a lot. But right now, we're witnessing that the opposition parties are having extensive consultations with each other. So there should be definitely some interesting developments in that area as well.
Now, Sergey, a last question for you. Now, speaking of the opposition, do you think the opposition now has a chance to unite all those protesting in the whole country against the Dream Party, and which can give them a window to actually win the October elections?
I'm not a specialist in Georgian politics, and of course Georgi would probably answer in greater detail. But what I can say, I have many, so to speak, spies who moved from Russia as refugees to Georgia, and they happen to be social sciences. So they're making their observations, and they would probably agree with what Georgi just said. And the majority of voters who are really active reside in the capital city of Tbilisi and some other major cities. So this is extremely important. So in that respect, Tbilisi for the rest of the country is even more important than Moscow for the rest of Russia. But what also my colleagues have pointed out, which is extremely important for the opposition in Georgia to be more coherent and better mobilized for joint action, is that the European leadership is extremely tardy. That's exactly the time when they should have issued a very, very strong statement really condemning the ruling party of Georgia of introducing totally anti-democratic laws. This action on the European part is obviously not enough. And if we want to see better joint action of the Georgian opposition, we should also expect much better involvement of the European authorities.